The church in Redemption Ridge was stifling, full of the smell of lye soap, stale wool, and desperation. It was late August, 1883, and the air held a dry, brittle heat that promised a hard winter. This was the bride selection, an event arranged by Preacher Miller for the homesteaders and ranchers whose properties were too remote to allow for proper courting. The women sat on the left side of the aisle, the men on the right. The available women were a quiet, anxious flock. There was Miss Albright, the schoolmarm, who at 31 was considered firmly on the shelf. Her face was sharp and her back was straight, but her hands were twisting a plain handkerchief in her lap. Beside her sat the preacher's own daughters, Mary and Martha Miller, pale girls with downcast eyes who looked terrified of being chosen and more terrified of being left behind. And then, separate from them all, was Willa Hart. She did not sit in the pews with the respectable prospects. She stood near the back door, as if ready to flee. She wore a high-necked dress of dark brown calico, washed so many times it had no life left in it. It was a dress meant to signal modesty, but the town of Redemption Ridge had a long memory. They saw the dress, but they remembered the red satin of the Golden Nugget Saloon. They remembered the scandal. Willa Hart was a fallen woman, a name spoken in whispers by the same women who now refused to meet her eye. Mrs. Thatcher, the mercantile owner's wife, leaned over to Mrs. Miller. An absolute disgrace, she breathed, loud enough for the back pew to hear, letting her stand in the house of God for this. Willa kept her gaze fixed on a crack in the floorboards. She had not come here with hope. She had come because she had eaten her last heel of bread yesterday morning, and the $2 remaining in her coin purse would not buy her another week's rent. This was not a search for love. It was the last, most desperate bid for survival. The selection process was a humiliation dressed in scripture. Preacher Miller would read a name from the men's ledger, and the man would stand, walk across the aisle, and make his choice. It was a livestock auction with prayer. Jedediah Smith, a young homesteader with acne and nervous hands, chose Martha Miller, who burst into silent tears. Cyrus Brown, a widower twice Jedediah's age, chose Miss Albright, who looked more relieved than happy. The door at the back of the church creaked open. Silas McCrae stepped inside, his hat in his hands. He did not enter like the other men, shuffling and looking at their boots. He moved with a quiet authority, his gaze sweeping the room once before settling on the preacher. He was a man made of hard angles, from his jaw to his broad shoulders, wrapped in denim and worn leather. His face was weathered by sun and wind, and his eyes held a stillness that bordered on grief. A different kind of whisper went through the room. Silas McCrae was not some desperate homesteader. He owned the High Lonesome Ranch, a hard piece of land north of the ridge, but it was his. He was a widower, his tragedy common enough in this land, a dispute over water rights, a raid, his wife and young son murdered 3 years prior. He was considered a good catch, a man of substance, though one broken by his past. Preacher Miller cleared his throat, surprised. "Mr. McCrae, we had not expected you." "I'm here now," Silas said. His voice was low and rough, like stones rubbing together. "Very well. As it is your turn on the ledger," the preacher gestured, inviting him to choose. Every unmarried woman held her breath. Miss Albright's shoulders tensed. Perhaps she could do better than Cyrus Brown, Mary Miller. The last remaining daughter looked faint with possibility. Silas McCrae did not look at the pews. His boots made a heavy, deliberate sound on the floorboards as he walked past the eligible women, past the shocked face of Preacher Miller, and stopped directly in front of Willa Hart. The church went profoundly silent. The only sound was a fly buzzing against the hot window pane. Willa looked up. Her first instinct was fear. Men who approached her this directly usually wanted only one thing, and they never offered marriage for it. She saw his height, the shadow he cast, and braced herself. But his eyes were not cruel. They were not leering. They were just tired. He looked at her not as a piece of saloon property, but as a person. And the directness of it was more unnerving than any insult. "Miss Hart," he said. Willa's throat was dry. "Mr. McCrae. I have a ranch north of here. It's hard land. I need a wife." It was not a proposal. It was a statement of fact, as plain and unadorned as the man himself. He was not offering her salvation. He was offering her a position. She looked past him, at the faces of the townswomen. Mrs. Thatcher's mouth was a perfect, scandalized Mrs. Miller looked as if she might faint. In their shock, Willa found a small, bitter kernel of strength. She looked back at Silas. "Why me?" she whispered, her voice rough from disuse. "Because you're the only one here who knows what it is to have nothing left to lose," he said, so quietly only she could hear. "And I reckon you know how to survive." She searched his face for the trick, the hidden cruelty, the angle. There was none, just a vast, empty landscape in his eyes that matched the one inside her. "I have a bag," she said. "I have a wagon," he replied. He turned and walked out of the church. Willa followed him, the sound of the door closing behind her echoing with the collective gasp of Redemption Ridge. Her room above the mercantile was small, hot, and smelled of dust and dried herbs from the store below. She had one small carpet bag. As she pulled her few possessions from the drawer, 2 worn shirts, a mended skirt, a bar of soap, the past rose up and threatened to choke her. She had not always been Willa Hart, the saloon girl. 4 years ago, she had been Willa Hart, the respectable jeweler's assistant, engaged to Elias Thorne. Elias was a clerk at the hardware, a handsome man with soft hands and easy promises. He had given her a small silver locket and promised her a house with a white picket fence, a life scrubbed clean of hardship. Then the Golden Nugget Saloon had opened. Willa, needing money to help care for her younger sister. Sadie had taken a job there, not as one of those girls. She had insisted, just serving drinks, cleaning tables. But in a town like Redemption Ridge, the mud sticks. She remembered the feel of the rough wood of the bar under her palms, the smell of whiskey and unwashed men, the piano, always slightly out of tune, and she remembered Jasper Croft. Croft was a gambler, all slick charm and a diamond stick pin. He had an eye for weakness, and he had seen it in Sadie. Sadie, at 17, was all light and air, desperate for a life bigger than the one their small house offered. Willa had tried to protect her, to steer her away from Croft's poisonous charisma. One night, Elias Thorne had seen Willa talking to Croft. She had been warning him away, her voice low and fierce, but Elias saw only the scene, his fiancée, in a saloon, speaking intimately with a gambler. He broke the engagement the next day, on the steps of the church, right after Sunday service. He called her saloon trash, unfit to be his wife. The locket, he said. She could keep his payment for services rendered. Willa had borne the shame, but Sadie had not. Sadie, believing Willa's fall had ruined their family's name and her own prospects, saw Jasper Croft as her only escape. She ran away with him 2 weeks later. Willa's last memory of her sister was a scribbled note left on a cold pillow, promising a grand new life in Cheyenne. 2 months later, the sheriff delivered the news. Sadie had been found in a cheap boarding house, an overdose of laudanum. Croft was long gone. The town decided its narrative. Willa Hart, the fallen woman, had dragged her own sister down with her. The jeweler fired her. Elias Thorne married the banker's daughter, and Willa, with nowhere else to go, had stayed at the Golden Nugget, the whisper solidifying into reputation. She closed the carpet bag. The locket was long gone, sold for medicine during a bad fever last winter. She had nothing left of that old life. Silas McCrae was right. She had nothing left to lose. He was waiting by a sturdy buckboard wagon, 2 strong mules already hitched. He took her bag without a word and tossed it in the back, then offered her a hand up to the seat. His grip was hard and impersonal. They rode out of Redemption Ridge. Willa did not look back. The journey was silent for the first hour. The wagon wheels cut through the thick dust of the main street and found the high trail that led north. The land changed quickly. The shallow, grassy valley gave way to rocky soil and high plains. The sky was an immense, pale blue, beautiful and unforgiving. The wind began to blow, a steady, keening sound that seemed to come from the bones of the earth itself. It was a bitter wind, carrying the first hint of autumn's chill. This was not gentle country. It was all granite outcroppings, sparse pine, and juniper. "This ain't farming land," Silas said, his voice startling her. He had not spoken since they left town. "This is surviving land." Willa just nodded, pulling her thin shawl tighter. They arrived at dusk. The High Lonesome Ranch was aptly named. It was nestled in a shallow basin, miles from any neighbor. Surrounded by rising hills, there was a small, sturdy cabin built of thick logs, a barn that leaned slightly to the west, and a series of corrals, one of which held a half-dozen horses. The place felt solid, but profoundly isolated. As Silas pulled the wagon to a halt, a chorus of yips and howls erupted from the hills. Coyotes. The sound was thin and lonely, echoing in the twilight. Willa felt a shiver trace its way down her spine. Silas climbed down from the wagon, his movements unhurried. "They stay distant, mostly." He began to unhitch the mules, his back to her. "The cabin's open." Willa slid down, her legs stiff. She grabbed her bag and walked to the cabin, her hand hesitating on the rough wooden latch. This was her new life, a cabin on a remote ranch with a silent man and howling animals. She pushed the door open. The inside was one large room, clean but sparse. A stone fireplace dominated one wall. Its hearth swept clean. A heavy table and 2 chairs sat in the center. A dry sink with a bucket and ladle stood against the far wall. In one corner was a large bed, neatly made with a thick quilt. There was a small, curtained-off alcove, and another small door that seemed to lead to a back room. Silas entered behind her, carrying a sack of flour. He dropped it by the dry sink. "That'll be yours," he said, nodding toward the small back room. "It was a storage room. I cleared it." Willa walked over and pushed the door open. It was little more than a closet, just big enough for a narrow cot and a small crate to serve as a table. A single, small window looked out onto the darkening hills. It was cold. She turned back to him. He was standing by the table, watching her. The shadows in the room were long, and she could not read his expression. "What do you expect from me, Mr. McCrae?" Her voice was hard, a shield she had worn for years. He did not flinch. He just looked at her, his gaze steady. "I expect you to carry your share. I expect you to be honest." A bitter laugh escaped her. "Is that all? The women in town think you bought a whore for cheap. They think you brought me here to be your mistress, not your wife." His face darkened, but the anger was not for her. It was for the town, for the words. "The women in town can mind their own business. I filed the marriage papers with the circuit judge before I came to the church. We're married. Miss Hart," he corrected himself, the word sounding foreign. "Mrs. McCrae." She flinched at the name. It felt like a costume she was being forced to wear. "I'm not looking for a mistress," he said, his voice flat. "I'm not looking for obedience. I'm just tired of being alone. I need a wife, a partner, not a servant." He held her gaze. "You'll be who you are. I'll ask for nothing else." Willa searched his face, looking for the lie. Men always wanted something. She had learned that lesson until it was carved on her bones. She didn't believe him, not yet, but she was too tired to argue. She nodded once. He seemed to take that as acceptance. He turned to the fireplace. "I'll start the fire. There's salt pork and beans." "Can you cook?" he asked. "I can heat beans," she replied. The meal was prepared in a heavy, suffocating silence. The only sounds were the scrape of the skillet on the hearth and the crackle of the juniper wood as it caught fire. The cabin grew warmer, but the tension remained. A single kerosene lamp on the table cast a small pool of flickering yellow light, leaving the corners of the room in deep shadow. They sat at the table, the plate of beans and pork between them. Silas ate steadily, his focus on his food. He seemed comfortable in the silence, as if it were an old friend. Willa was not. The silence felt watchful. She felt his presence across the table like a physical weight. She took a few bites, but the food tasted like ash. Her stomach was a cold, tight knot. Silas finished, pushing his plate back. He motioned to the heavy iron coffee pot sitting on the edge of the hearth. "Coffee?" She nodded, grateful for something to do. She stood and picked up the pot, using a rag to protect her hand from the heat. She walked to the table and held the pot over his cup. He was watching her. She felt his gaze on her hand. And her hand, the one she had trained to be so steady when pouring whiskey for loud, drunken men, began to tremble. It was a fine, sharp tremor at first, a betrayal. She gripped the handle tighter, trying to will it still, but the shaking only worsened. A small splash of hot coffee hit the wooden table. "I'm sorry," she whispered, humiliation burning her cheeks. She felt weak, useless. "It's just coffee." His voice was rough, but not unkind. He reached out, his large, calloused hand closing over hers, steadying the pot. He did not let go immediately. He held her hand and the pot, and guided it as he finished the pour himself. He released her. She pulled her hand back as if burned, her skin tingling where he had touched her. She sat down quickly, her heart hammering. The tension in the room had changed. It was no longer just suspicion. It was a sharp, sudden awareness. He had seen her weakness, and he had not mocked it. He drank his coffee. She drank hers. Neither of them spoke again. The next day, Silas was gone before the sun had fully breached the horizon. "Fixing fence line by the north pasture," he'd said. And then he was gone. Just a silhouette on horseback disappearing into the pale morning light. The cabin was quiet, terribly quiet. Willa was used to the noise of the saloon, the constant music, the shouting, the arguments. Here, the only sounds were the wind and the ticking of a small clock on the mantel. She was restless. She swept the floor, which was already clean. She scrubbed the skillet he had used for breakfast. She paced the length of the small cabin, from her cold room to the front door, feeling like a trapped animal. She needed to know this man. Survival depended on knowing the territory, and Silas McCrae was unknown land. Her gaze fell on his side of the room, the large bed, the small, worn trunk at its foot, and on the crate beside the bed, a large, leather-bound family Bible. She hesitated. It felt like a violation. But she had been violated by this town, by her past, by circumstance. This was a small, necessary trespass. She walked over and put her hand on the worn leather cover. It was cool to the touch. She opened it. The first pages were for family records. Silas McCrae married Sarah Albright. Albright, the schoolmarm's sister. She realized. Thomas McCrae, born June 4th, 1878. Willa's fingers traced the faded ink. Tucked between the pages of Genesis, where the stories of families began, was a photograph, a single tintype. It was of a woman and a small boy, Sarah and Thomas. The woman was not beautiful, but her face was full of a soft, uncomplicated kindness. She was smiling, her hair pulled back simply. The boy on her lap, perhaps 3 or 4 years old, had his father's dark hair and serious eyes. Willa stared at the image. A sharp, cold ache filled her chest. It was jealousy, but not for the man. It was jealousy for the life, for the rightness of it. This woman, Sarah, had belonged here. She had been a wife, a mother. She had held this child and slept in that bed and been loved in a way Willa could not even imagine. Willa was the usurper, the ghost. Her fingers ached to touch the cold metal plate, to trace the outline of the child's face. She did not. She closed the Bible gently, pushing the photograph back into the darkness between the pages. She straightened the book, placing it exactly as it had been, brushing away the faint trace of her fingerprints from the cover. She turned away from the bed, the ghosts of this other, happier family settling into the room with her, watching. That night, the wind rose to a howl. It was a high, mourning sound that pressed against the cabin walls and slipped through the cracks under the door. It sounded, Willa thought, like 1,000 lost souls. She was in her small room, lying on the cot. She was fully dressed, with the quilt pulled up to her chin, but the cold still found her. Silas was in the main room. She had heard the creak of his bed springs an hour ago. The cabin was pitch dark, the embers in the fireplace having died to a dull, barely visible glow. The silence between the gusts of wind was heavier than the wind itself. It was filled with the presence of the man in the next room and the ghosts of the woman and child in the Bible. Willa's voice came out of the darkness, small and thin against the gale. "You'll regret choosing me." It was a confession, a warning. She waited, her body tensed. She expected silence. She expected him to be asleep, or to ignore her, to leave her with the shame of speaking her fear aloud. The wind died for a moment, and the cabin was utterly still. Then, his voice came from the other side of the cabin. It was low, rough, and resonant in the dark. "I already regret waiting this long." Willa closed her eyes. The words made no sense. She could not understand their meaning, but they settled over her, not with warmth, but with weight. For the first time since Sadie died, she did not feel the desperate urge to run. She lay still, listening to the sound of the wind and the sound of his breathing. His words hung in the darkness long after the wind had swallowed them. "I already regret waiting this long." Willa lay awake on her narrow cot until the first cold, gray light of dawn touched the window. She did not understand him, and that lack of understanding was a sharp, unfamiliar stone in her shoe. Men were simple creatures in her experience. They wanted food, they wanted warmth, and they wanted a woman's body. Their motives were as plain as the nose on their face. Silas McCrae was not plain. He was a puzzle of sharp edges and quiet grief, and he had given her a cot in a storage room when he had every right, by the law of God and man, to demand the marriage bed. She rose before he did, her movements stiff in the cold cabin. She stirred the embers in the hearth, adding kindling and fresh logs until a proper fire was going. She put the coffee pot on to boil, the motions automatic. She had been rising in the dark for years, first to serve whiskey, now to serve a husband. When he emerged from the main part of the cabin, pulling on his suspenders over his long-sleeved wool shirt, he just nodded at the fire, then at the pot. Obliged. She did not know what to do with herself while he drank his coffee, standing by the fire, staring into the flames. In the saloon, she would have been wiping tables, stocking bottles. She felt useless. "What needs doing?" she asked. His gaze lifted from the fire. "There's chickens to feed, eggs to gather. The horses need water." "I can do that." "The feed is in the barn, in the bin by the door. The horses are in the south corral." He watched her pull her thin shawl around her shoulders. It was plainly not enough for the morning chill. He turned, took a heavy sheepskin-lined denim coat from a peg by the door, and held it out. Willa looked at the coat. It was worn, smelling faintly of leather. "Horse and him. That's yours." "I've got another. You'll freeze in that shawl. Take it." She took it. It was heavy and far too large. The sleeves hung past her fingers, but the wool lining was a blessing. She felt swallowed by it, but she was warm for the first time since arriving. She walked out into the sharp morning air. The High Lonesome Ranch was a harsh education. The 3 chickens were easy enough, clucking and scratching at the grain she threw. But the horses were another matter. They were large, powerful animals, and they watched her with wary, intelligent eyes. She was used to horses tied to hitching posts, half asleep. These were working animals, full of energy and suspicion. She fumbled with the latch on the pump, her town-soft hands struggling with the cold iron. It took her 3 tries to fill the trough, and she splashed icy water on her boots. She returned to the cabin to find Silas gone. A note left on the table in heavy, black pencil strokes: "Mending fence, back at dusk. Bread is in the flour sack, lard in the tin." She was to make bread. She had watched the baker in town, but her own experience was limited to reheating stale biscuits. She found the sack, the tin of lard, the yeast. She found a bowl. She tried to remember the proportions, the feel. Her first attempt was a disaster. The dough was a sticky, wet mess that clung to her hands and the table. Her second was too dry, a hard, pebbly lump. She worked in frustration, her hands aching, flour streaking her face and matting in her hair. Finally, she got a loaf that looked something like bread. She put it in the heavy iron oven by the fire, unsure how long to leave it. She waited. She worried. When she pulled it out, the smell told the story. The bottom was charcoal black, the top pale and raw-looking. She stood staring at the burned loaf, and a hot, bitter frustration rose in her throat. She had failed at the simplest, most fundamental wifely task. She was a saloon girl, a woman who could calm a drunk and count cards, but she could not make a loaf of bread. She threw it out the back door for the chickens, who pecked at it suspiciously. When Silas returned at dark, he did not mention the smell of burned flour that still hung in the air. He simply looked at the hardtack biscuits she had found in a tin and served with the salt pork. He ate 3 of them without complaint. The days settled into a hard, silent routine. Willa learned the ranch by trial and searing error. She learned to carry the heavy water buckets one at a time, instead of trying to use the yoke and failing. She learned which of the horses would accept an apple and which would shy away. She learned that the wind was a constant, scouring presence. She struggled. She was not built for this life. Her back ached from mending shirts. Her shoulders burned from the weight of the water. She tried to split kindling, the axe heavy and unwieldy in her hands. She brought it down with a clumsy, dangerous chop, missing the wood entirely and burying the axe head in the dirt. She looked around, terrified he had seen her. He was nowhere. She gave up, gathering small, dry branches instead, feeling useless. The next morning, when she stepped outside into the cold dark, a neat stack of perfectly split kindling was piled by the door. She stopped, her hand on the latch. She looked toward the barn, where a single lantern glowed. He was already there, milking his single cow. He had seen her fail. He had waited until she was gone, and then he had done the work himself. He did not coddle her. He did not interfere, but he watched. When she struggled to lift a small sack of feed, he was nowhere to be seen. But the next day, he had stacked a half-dozen smaller canvas bags by the bin, already filled, each one a weight she could manage, when her hands, chapped and raw from the lye soap and the cold water, cracked and bled. She found a tin of saddle salve sitting by the dry sink. He never spoke of these things. She never thanked him. It was a silent conversation, an acknowledgement of her effort and his patience. The tension between them remained, a taut wire pulled between his ghosts and her shame. They ate every meal in near silence. They slept separated by a single thin wall. The first snow came in late October. It was not a gentle dusting, but a sudden, violent arrival. The sky, which had been a clear, cold gray at noon, turned a thick bruised white by 2 o'clock. The wind, which had been a murmur, became a scream. Silas came in from the barn, snow caking his hat and shoulders. "It's a norther," he said, his voice tight. "A bad one. We need to cover the animals. Now!" He grabbed a heavy canvas tarpaulin from a peg. "The chickens will be fine in the coop. But the horses in the corral need shelter. And the cow. "What do I do?" Willa asked, pulling on the heavy coat. "Help me get this tarp over the north side of the corral. It'll break the wind. Then we move the mare and the cow into the barn." The world outside the cabin was a howling chaos of white. The snow was not falling. It was moving sideways, driven by a wind so cold it felt like needles in her skin. Within seconds, the cold pierced her dress and her coat. They fought their way to the corral. The horses were huddled together, their backs to the wind, coated in ice. "Grab that end!" Silas yelled over the shriek of the storm. Willa grabbed the stiff, frozen corner of the tarpaulin. The wind immediately snatched it from her grip, whipping it like a sail. "Hold on to it!" Silas roared. She lunged for it again, gripping the frozen canvas with both hands. The wind pulled, trying to rip it from her. She held on, her teeth gritted. Silas was on the other side, using his strength and weight to battle the storm, tying the ropes to the fence posts. Willa's hands went from aching to stinging, to nothing. She lost all feeling in them. They were just clumps of wood at the ends of her arms. She knew she was holding the tarp, but she could not feel it. "The rope!" Silas shouted. "Tie it off!" He threw her a length of rope. She stared at it. She could not make her fingers bend. She tried to wrap the rope around the post, but her hands were useless. They would not close. "Willa!" "I cannot," she cried, the words torn from her mouth by the wind. "I cannot feel my hands." He looked at her. Her face was pale, her lips turning blue. He swore. A single, sharp word. He left his own end of the tarp, lunged across, and in two powerful motions, tied off her corner. The tarp snapped taut, a thin, rattling wall against the blizzard. "Go inside," he ordered. The mare. "Go inside, now!" She turned to obey, but her legs felt heavy, her body clumsy with cold. She had taken only 2 steps when he was behind her. He did not ask. He did not warn her. He simply put one arm under her legs and the other behind her back, lifting her as if she weighed nothing. He wrapped the edges of his own coat around her, shielding her with his body, and carried her through the blinding snow toward the cabin. She was too cold, too shocked, to protest. She pressed her face against the rough wool of his shirt, inhaling the scent of him, and felt the steady, powerful beat of his heart against her cheek. He kicked the cabin door open and deposited her on the floor by the hearth, slamming the door against the storm. "Do not move," he commanded. He grabbed a bucket, opened the door, and disappeared back into the white. He returned a moment later with the bucket full of snow. "Take off your gloves," he said. She fumbled with the wet leather, but her fingers would not work. He knelt before her, his expression grim. He grasped her wrist and pulled the glove off, then the other. Her hands were a waxy, frightening white. He cursed again, low and soft. He grabbed a handful of snow and began to rub her hands, hard. It was agony. It was 1,000 needles of fire, a pain so sharp it made her gasp. "It hurts," she cried, trying to pull away. "It is supposed to hurt," he said, his voice rough. He did not stop. He held her wrists in a grip of iron, rubbing and chafing her frozen hands with the snow, forcing the blood back into them. "It means they are coming back." She gritted her teeth, tears of pain freezing on her cheeks, and endured it. He worked until the awful, dead white turned to a raw, angry red, and the feeling had returned in a wave of burning. Finally, he let her go. He stood, his face dark with a worry she did not understand. "Keep them by the fire. I have to get the animals." He left. Willa was alone for an hour, the cabin shaking in the wind. She sat on the hearth, her hands tucked under her arms, the pain slowly dulling to a throb. When he returned, he was covered in ice, his beard and eyebrows white. He slammed the door, bolted it, and leaned against it, breathing hard. "It is done," he said. The storm raged for 2 days. They were trapped. The wind never stopped. a high-pitched, relentless howl that burrowed into the mind. Snow piled in drifts against the windows, blocking out what little light there was. They lived in the yellow bubble of the kerosene lamp and the red glow of the fire. The silence of their routine was shattered. The cabin, which had seemed sparse, now felt small. A cage for two restless animals. They moved around each other, always aware, always careful. On the second night, the tension was unbearable. The storm seemed to be inside the cabin as well as out. Willa could not sit still. She paced from the table to the dry sink, her nerves raw. Silas sat at the table, sharpening a knife, the shing-shing-shing of the wet stone scraping against the sound of the wind. She needed something, a release. She went to his small cupboard, where she knew he kept a bottle. She pulled out the brown bottle of whiskey in a single glass. She poured 2 fingers and drank it fast. It burned, but it was a familiar fire. It steadied her. She looked at him. He had stopped sharpening the knife. He was just watching her, his dark eyes unreadable in the lamplight. "In the saloon," she said, her voice rough. "We drank this for the cold, and for the noise, to make it go away." "Does it work?" he asked. "For a little while." She poured another measure, her hand steadier this time. She sat at the table, across from him. The whiskey made her bold. "You never speak of them," she said, her voice quiet. He did not pretend to misunderstand. His gaze dropped to the knife in his hands. "There is nothing to say. The town talks. They say it was raiders." He tested the edge of the blade with his thumb. "It was not raiders. Not in the way they mean. It was 3 men, from the bar T, over water rights." He spoke to the knife, not to her. "This land is dry. The creek that runs through my north pasture is the only reliable water for 10 miles. They wanted me to sell the rights. I told them no. The water was for my stock." He set the knife down. "I told them no 3 times. The 3rd time, they did not send a man to talk. They came themselves. At dawn." The fire crackled. The wind screamed. "I was in the barn. I heard Sarah. I heard her scream. By the time I got back to the house, it was done." His voice was flat, devoid of all emotion. "They shot her first, while she was making breakfast. Thomas, my son, he was 3. He was playing by the fire." Silas looked up, and his eyes were not empty. They were filled with a cold, clear, bottomless hate. "They burned the house. With them inside, I was shot in the shoulder, trying to get to them. I woke up 2 days later. My neighbor, Old Man Hemlock, found me." He touched his left shoulder. An unconscious, old gesture. Willa stared at him, the whiskey forgotten. This was not the vague tragedy the town whispered about. This was a butchering. This was a grief so profound it had no bottom. Her own shame, her own small sorrows, felt petty and thin. "They were caught?" she whispered. "One was. I found the other 2. They did not make it to trial." He said it simply, a fact, like saying he had mended a fence, and Willa had no doubt it was true. This man, so quiet and controlled, had a capacity for terrible, final justice. The silence that followed was different. It was not empty. It was full of the ghosts of Sarah and Thomas. Willa felt a terrible, aching empathy. She looked at his shoulder, where his hand had rested. She saw, in the firelight, the pucker of an old scar near his collar, where his shirt was open. Without thinking, driven by an impulse she could not name, she stood. She moved around the table and stood beside him. He did not look up. She lifted her hand, her fingers still raw and red from the frost. She hesitated. Then gently, she touched the scar. Her fingers rested on the damaged, healed flesh. It was the first time she had touched him with intent, with anything other than accident. Silas went perfectly still. He did not breathe. He closed his eyes. She felt the heat of his skin, the hard muscle beneath. She felt the tremor that ran through him. He turned his head slowly and looked up at her. His face was a mask of old pain. He lifted his own hand and covered hers, pressing her palm flat against his shoulder, holding her there. The air in the cabin became thick, hard to breathe. The sound of the wind, the fire, all of it faded. There was only the heat from his skin, the pressure of his hand on hers. He leaned in. She saw the desire in his eyes, stark and clear, mixed with a loneliness so deep it matched her own. She should have felt fear. She should have felt repulsion. She felt a pull, a dark, heavy warmth. He was going to kiss her. She was going to let him. He was inches away. She could smell the faint scent of wood smoke and whiskey on his breath. And then the image of the photograph in the Bible flashed in her mind. Sarah McCrae, with her kind, good face, the face of a proper wife. Willa snatched her hand back as if the scar had burned her. "I cannot," she whispered. Her voice choked. She backed away, retreating to the shadows by the far wall. Silas stared at the empty space where she had been. The mask of control fell back into place. He closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them. He looked empty again. I am not her," Willa stammered. "I am not what you should want. I am a saloon girl. Silas, I am ruined." He stood, his chair scraping loudly on the wood floor. He looked at her, his face hard. "Do not ever," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Tell me what I should want, and do not call yourself that in this house again." He turned, walked to his bed, and lay down, fully clothed, his back to her. The storm broke on the third morning. The world was white, silent, and clean. The wind was gone. Willa woke from a fitful sleep on her cot. Silas was already outside. She hurried, pulling on the big coat, and went out. The snow was hip-deep in places, the sky a painful, brilliant blue. Silas was by the south corral, staring. The tarp was still there, but the snow had drifted high against it. "What is it?" Willa asked, wading through the snow. "The mare, the sorrel, she is gone." "How? The fence?" "Adrift, on the west side. She must have walked right over it during the night, when the wind died." He squinted against the bright sun, scanning the endless white hills. "She will head for the low canyons, looking for grass. She will freeze or the wolves will get her." "You are going after her." "I have to." He turned and started for the barn. "I am coming with you," she said. He stopped. "No, you are not. You will slow me down. Your hands are not healed." "My hands are fine. You cannot track a horse and lead another through this snow. You need someone to hold the pack horse. I can ride." He looked at her, doubt plain on his face. "I can ride," she insisted, lying. She had ridden a pony at a county fair when she was 12. He stared at her for a long moment, judging, "If you fall behind, I will leave you." "I will not fall behind." They were riding in an hour. He put her on his steadiest horse, an old buckskin. He rode his own stallion, leading a third horse loaded with supplies. The work was brutal. The snow was deep and soft, and the horses struggled, sinking to their chests. They followed the tracks the mare had left, a clear path leading west, toward the rocky overhangs. By noon, Willa was exhausted. Every muscle in her body screamed. She was not lying, she was just holding on. But she did not complain. She just watched his broad back and kept going. Late in the afternoon, the wind picked up again. It came from nowhere, a sudden, frigid gale, whipping the new snow into a blinding cloud. "We cannot track in this," Silas yelled, turning his horse. "We need shelter." He pointed to a dark line of rocks on a ridge to their north. "The overhangs! Come on!" They pushed the horses hard, the wind trying to turn them. They reached the rock formation just as the visibility dropped to zero. It was a shallow cave, a rocky overhang that provided a break from the wind, though not the cold. They were trapped again. Silas unsaddled the horses, rubbing them down. covering them with blankets. Willa, her hands aching, built a small fire with the wood he had packed. They huddled by the weak flames, the wind howling around their small shelter. The temperature was dropping fast. "She is gone," Silas said. He was staring into the fire, his face grim. "The mare is gone. The wolves will have her by morning." He sounded defeated. It was the first time she had heard that tone in his voice. Willia looked at him, at his strong profile lit by the small fire. He had confessed his deepest wound to her. She owed him a truth of her own. "It was not just the saloon," she said, her voice quiet. He turned to look at her. "Why I pulled away, why the town hates me. It was not just for serving whiskey." She took a breath, the cold air burning her lungs. "I was engaged, before the saloon, to a clerk, Elias Thorne. I had a younger sister, Sadie. She was 17. She was beautiful, and she wanted everything." Willa stared into the flames. "I took the job at the saloon to help pay for her dresses. And a gambler came to town. His name was Jasper Croft. He was handsome, and he had money. I thought I was in love with him. Elias broke our engagement over it." "Sadie," Willa continued, her voice breaking. "She saw Jasper as an escape, especially after Elias shamed me. She thought I had ruined us, so she ran away with him to Cheyenne." She stopped. The memory was a physical pain. "I got a letter from a sheriff. 2 months later, they found her in a cheap boarding house. She had taken too much laudanum. Jasper Croft was gone. He had taken her money and left her." The tears she had refused to shed for years began to fall. They froze on her cheeks. "The town said I led her into that life. Elias said I killed her, and they were right. I introduced them. I brought Jasper to our house. I was so blinded by his charm. I did not see what he was doing to her. She died alone, in a cold room, because of me. It was my fault." She was sobbing now, the quiet, racking sobs of a grief held too long. Silas watched her. He did not say anything. He just watched her cry. When her sobs began to quiet, he moved. He sat beside her, so close their legs were touching. He put his arm around her shoulders and pulled her against his side. Willia tensed, startled, but he did not do anything more. He just held her. He was solid and warm. He was a wall against the wind. She leaned her head against his shoulder, exhausted, and cried out the last of her strength. He held her, his grip firm, until she was just a trembling quiet. "You did not give her the bottle," he said, his voice a low rumble against her ear. "You did not leave her in that room. A person makes their own choices. Willa, the rest is just life, pressing in." She had no energy to argue. She just sat there, absorbing his warmth, his simple, declarative absolution. The fire burned low. The cold became intense, dangerous. "We have to sleep," he said. "We need to share the blankets, or we will not see morning." He laid out the saddle blankets on the stone floor, then the heavy wool blankets he had packed. He lay down on his back and looked at her. "Come here." It was not a request. It was a statement of survival. Willia lay down beside him, her back to him. She was trembling, but not just from the cold. He pulled the other blankets over them, tucking them in tightly. Then he pressed his body against hers. She went rigid. He was hard and warm from her back to her knees. He put his arm over her waist, pulling her flush against his chest. "It is for warmth," he whispered, his breath warm on her neck. "Just warmth. Close your eyes." She lay there, her heart hammering so hard she was sure he could feel it. She was pressed against a man, a stranger. His body was a furnace. His arm over her was a heavy, possessive weight. The tension in the small cave was so sharp, it felt like it could cut glass. It was not the simple, dirty desire of the saloon. It was something more complicated. It was rooted in shared confessions, in shared survival. It was unbearable. He did not move. He just held her, his breathing slow and steady. She lay awake for hours, trapped between the cold stone beneath her and the hot, hard body behind her. She had never felt so terrified, or so safe. The winter broke. It did not leave gracefully. It fought, clawing its way back with the late freezes and biting winds. But the sun was stronger now. The snow receded from the basin, leaving behind a world of thick, sucking mud and the promise of new grass. The creek, the one Silas's family had died for, swelled into a roaring, joyous thing, the sound of running water a constant comfort. Life on the High Lonesome settled into a new rhythm, one not dictated by the desperate edge of survival. They had returned from the overhangs without the sorrel mare. Silas had tracked her for another day, only to find the signs of a wolf pack. He had come back to the cabin silent, his face carved from granite, but the loss and the confessions shared in the cold had changed the air in the cabin. The silence was no longer empty. It was full of the things they both knew, the ghosts they had acknowledged. Willa's hands, once chapped and bleeding, toughened. The work that had once seemed impossible, the water, the feed, the endless mending, became simple routine. She still slept on her cot in the small, cold room, and he in the large bed, but the wall between them felt thinner. One afternoon in April, she was mending one of his work shirts by the open door. A new calf, born just that morning, was trying to find its legs in the corral. It wobbled, splayed its legs wide, and plopped down backward in the mud. Its mother nudged it impatiently. The calf tried again, all knees and confusion, and stumbled head over heels. A sound startled Willa. It was a short, rusty noise that came from her own throat. A laugh. Silas, who was oiling a harness on the porch, went still. His hands stopped their work. He looked at her, his expression unreadable. Willa's hand flew to her mouth, her face flushing. It felt like a betrayal, this sound of lightness in a life defined by shadow. He did not smile, but the deep lines of tension around his eyes eased. He just gave a single, short nod and returned to his work. She began to find more reasons for it. The way the chickens scattered when she threw the grain, the determined, grumpy face of the old buckskin horse when he wanted an apple. They were small, quiet moments of humor, and Silas never pointed them out. But she felt him observing her, watching the thaw inside her match the one outside. She wanted to thank him, not for the coat or the kindling or his defense in town, but for something larger, for letting her be. She decided to cook for him, a real meal, not just the functional salt pork and beans. She had heard him, weeks ago, mention his mother's beef and barley stew. It was an ambitious, foolish undertaking. Her bread was passable now, no longer a burned brick, but this was a craft. She found a side of venison he had hanging in the cold shed. She hacked off a piece, cutting the meat into chunks. She found the sack of barley, the onions, the carrots. She put it all in the heavy Dutch oven, added water and salt, and hung it over the fire to simmer all day. The cabin filled with a thick, rich smell. Willa felt a dangerous kernel of pride. She tasted it once, around noon, and thought it needed more. She added more salt. When Silas came in at dusk, stamping the mud from his boots, he stopped just inside the door. He inhaled deeply. "Stew," he said. The word was full of approval. Willa's heart swelled. She felt, for the first time, like a wife. She ladled a deep bowl for him and set it on the table. She sat opposite, her hands clasped in her lap, watching him. He took a large spoonful. He chewed it. His jaw worked, slowly, deliberately. He swallowed. His expression did not change. "It is good," he said. Willa, beaming, took a small taste for herself. The pride vanished, replaced by instant, burning humiliation. It was terrible. It was a disaster. The meat was tough as a dried shingle. The barley was still crunchy. And the salt, she had mistaken the tins. It was not just salty. It was a brutal, briny stew, like drinking seawater. It was inedible.
"Do not,"
she whispered, her face crimson.
"Please, Silas, do not eat that. It is awful. I ruined it."
She reached to take the bowl. He put his hand up, stopping her. He looked at her. He looked at the bowl. He picked up his spoon and took another large, deliberate bite. "It is fine," he said, his voice flat. "It is not. It is full of salt. It is—" "I have eaten worse. Willa—" And he ate. He ate the entire bowl. He ate every tough piece of meat, every crunchy grain of barley, every brine-soaked carrot. He did not grimace. He did not rush. He just ate it, as if it were the finest meal he had ever had. When he was finished, he scraped the bowl clean. He pushed it back, stood, and drank 2 full dippers of water from the bucket. He looked at her, standing mortified by the fire. "Thank you for the meal." He picked up his hat and went to check on the horses. Willa stared at his empty bowl, her vision blurred. He had eaten her failure, spoonful by spoonful, just to spare her the shame. The spring thaw meant a trip to Redemption Ridge for supplies. The trails were passable, and they were low on flour, coffee, and the salt she had so thoroughly wasted. Willa's stomach knotted. She had not been back since the day of the selection. "I need you to get the list from Thatcher," Silas said, hitching the wagon. "I have business at the land office about the grazing rights." The ride into town was tense. As they rolled down the main street, Willa felt the eyes. The town had survived the winter, and now it was waking up, hungry for gossip. "Mrs. Thatcher was sweeping the boardwalk in front of the Mercantile. Her gaze raked over Willa, sharp and assessing. She was clearly noting the changes. Willa was no longer the pale, haunted woman from the church. The wind and sun had put color in her cheeks. She looked stronger. She wore Silas's old sheepskin coat, and she sat on the wagon bench not like a prisoner, but like a wife. Silas helped her down. His hand rested on her elbow for a moment, a simple, supportive gesture to the watching eyes of Mrs. Thatcher. It was a scandal. "Mr. McCrae," Mrs. Thatcher said, her voice like cracked ice. "Ma'am." Silas went to the land office. Willa, her list clutched in her hand, pushed open the door to the Mercantile. The whispers started before the bell had stopped ringing. Mrs. Miller, the preacher's wife, and Mrs. Albright, the schoolmarm's sister-in-law, were by the fabric bolts. "Goodness, look at her," Mrs. Albright murmured, not bothering to lower her voice much. "Bold as brass. He actually brought her to town." "I hear," Mrs. Miller whispered back, "that he is treating her as a real wife. It is a mockery, a pure mockery of his sainted Sarah's memory. You cannot make a silk purse from a sow's ear. Once they are stained for good." Willa kept her back to them. Her shoulders were rigid. The familiar sting of judgment, the hot shame, washed over her. It was the same feeling she had endured for years, but it was different now. Before, the shame was hers alone. Now, they were shaming him, too. She gave her list to Mr. Thatcher, who avoided her eyes. As she was waiting, Preacher Miller entered the store. His eyes landed on Willa, and his face, usually set in lines of pastoral kindness, hardened into disapproval. He ignored her, walking straight outside to wait on the boardwalk. Willa watched through the dusty window as Silas emerged from the land office. The preacher stepped directly into his path. "Silas," Preacher Miller said, his voice low but carrying on the quiet street. "A word." Silas stopped, his face impassive. "Preacher, I must speak plainly. I am hearing talk that this arrangement you have made is becoming something unseemly, that you are honoring this woman in a way that is not fit." "She is my wife," Silas said. The words were flat, hard stones. "She is a stain, man," the preacher's voice rose, righteous and angry. "A fallen woman you have brought into your home. into the very bed of your sainted wife. It is one thing to offer charity to a sinner. It is another to wallow in the mud with them. A man builds a home on truth. Silas, not on shame. Mrs. Thatcher was standing in her doorway now, watching. Mr. Thatcher had stopped weighing the coffee beans. Silas did not move. He looked at the preacher for a long, cold moment. He seemed to draw all the hardness from the land around him into himself. "You tend to your church, preacher," Silas said, his voice dangerously quiet. "I will tend to my home, and my wife." The preacher's face turned red. "You will not apologize for this blasphemy? For this disregard for your own good name?" "I apologize for nothing." Silas turned his back on the stunned preacher, a profound, final insult. He walked into the mercantile, strode past Willa and took the heavy sacks of flour from the counter. He paid his bill in silence. "Let us go," he said to her. They loaded the wagon, the eyes of the town burning into Willa's back. They rode out of Redemption Ridge, leaving a cloud of shocked silence behind them. The ride back to the High Lonesome was 8 miles of suffocating silence. Willa sat rigid on the bench, the whispers echoing in her head. Stain, shame, mockery. He was right. The preacher was right. She had brought her disgrace to his door. He had defended her, and in doing so, he had stained himself. He was quiet now because he was realizing his mistake. The shame she felt was so thick she could barely breathe. When they reached the ranch, she practically jumped from the wagon, moving with a frantic, jerky energy. She hauled the supplies into the cabin, her hands shaking. She did not speak. She put everything away, the tins clattering. Then she fled. She went to the small porch, the sun setting in a blaze of purple and blood red over the hills. The beauty of it felt like an accusation. She gripped the rough porch rail, the splintery wood digging into her palms. She gripped it until her knuckles shone white in the twilight. She was trying to hold herself together, to push the voices, the shame, back down. She heard the heavy thud of his boots on the cabin floor, then on the porch behind her. "Willa."
Do not,
she whispered, her voice fracturing.
please, just do not touch me.
He stopped. "What is it?" "He was right." The words tore out of her, raw and ugly. "The preacher, Mrs. Albright, all of them. They are right. I am what they say I am. I am a stain. I am shame. And I have brought it to you." She turned, her eyes wild, her face pale. "You defended me. You ate that awful stew. You gave me your coat. And all I do is make a mockery of you. They are laughing at you because of me. You should have left me at the church. You should have let me starve. Look at me." His voice was low, intense.
No, I cannot. You do not see. I am ruining you, just like I ruined Sadie. Everything I touch, I poison.
"Stop," he said.
Please,
She begged, tears starting to stream down her face.
do not be kind to me. I cannot bear it. Just use me, like they all said you would. At least I would understand that. At least it would make sense. But this kindness, I am not clean. I am not good. I am...
"Will ya?" He moved in one step, his hands clamping down on her shoulders. She flinched, a sob breaking in her throat.
Do not touch me,
She pleaded, her hands coming up to push against his chest, but there was no strength in them.
I am not her. I am not Sarah. I am nothing.
"You are wrong," he said, his voice rough. He pulled her to him. She fought, a weak, desperate pushing. "Silas, no!" He did not kiss her. He held her. He wrapped his arms around her shaking body and just held her, crushing her against his chest. He held her while she sobbed, while she beat her fists weakly against his shirt. He held her as if he were a stone wall and she were a storm, and he would not let her break. "You are not a stain," he whispered into her hair, his voice fierce. "You are not shame. You are a woman who has survived, and you are mine." The fight drained out of her. the rigid lines of her body, held taut by years of shame, suddenly shattered. She went limp in his arms, her hands grabbing the front of his shirt, holding on as if she were drowning. The need to be pure, the need to be safe, it all vanished. It was replaced by a simpler, more powerful, and more honest hunger, the need to be wanted. She sank into him, her face buried in his chest. He lifted her then, he lifted her easily, as he had in the snowstorm. But this was not a rescue, it was a claiming. He carried her into the cabin, kicking the door shut behind them. He did not light the lamp. The only light came from the deep red glow of the embers in the hearth. He walked past her small, cold room. He walked to the main part of the cabin, to the large bed that had been his, that had been theirs. He set her down gently on the quilt. He stood over her, a tall, dark shadow in the room. She was terrified. She was not terrified of him, but of this final, fragile surrender. He knelt by the side of the bed. He did not touch her. He just waited, giving her the choice he had always promised her. Her hand was shaking. Slowly, she lifted it. She reached out and touched his face. Her fingers traced the hard line of his jaw, the rough stubble. He closed his eyes and leaned into her touch, his own hand coming up to cover hers, pressing it against his skin. It was slow. It was not the hurried, selfish fumbling she had known, or the cold transactions of the saloon. It was a patient, tender unwrapping. His calloused, rough hands were surprisingly gentle as they fumbled with the tiny buttons of her dress. Her trembling fingers learned the shape of his shoulders, the hard map of his chest. She had scars, a thin white line on her ribs where a drunkard's bottle had broken, a puckered knot of old burn tissue on her shoulder. She tried to cover them, to hide the evidence of her past. Silas stopped her. He took her hands and moved them away. In the dim, red light, he leaned down. He touched the scar on her ribs, his fingers tracing its length. She flinched. "He did not," Silas whispered, his voice thick, "deserve to touch you." And he kissed the scar. He kissed the burn on her shoulder. He kissed every mark her past had left on her, as if he were erasing them one by one. When they came together, it was not a taking. It was a meeting. It was raw and quiet and desperate. It was two profoundly lonely people finding a moment of shelter in each other. It was the healing of a wound. Afterward, they lay tangled in the quilts, the cabin silent but for the sound of their breathing and the faint whisper of the night wind. Willa lay with her head on his chest, her ear pressed to the steady, strong beat of his heart. It was the most peaceful sound she had ever known. The shame was gone, burned away in the heat they had made, but in its place was a new, fragile, and terrifying vulnerability. "Silas," she whispered to the darkness. His hand, which was resting on her back, stroked her hair. "I am here. I am not afraid of this," she said, her voice small, almost lost. "Of being loved. I do not think I am. Anyway." She took a shaky breath. "I'm terrified," she confessed, "of being left again." He was silent for a long time. His hand continued its slow, steady movement on her hair. "I am not Elias Thorne," he said finally, his voice a low rumble in her ear. "And I am not Jasper Croft. I do not leave." She closed her eyes, and for the first time since she was a small girl, she slept without fear. She woke to the sound of an axe. The sun was streaming through the window, bright and clear. She was alone in the big bed. She sat up, pulling the quilt around her, and heard the steady thwack, thwack, thwack of Silas splitting firewood. She felt sore. She felt new. She stood, wrapped the quilt around her, and went to the hearth to start the coffee, a small, shy smile on her face. That is when she heard it. The sound of a horse, riding hard, too hard for a neighbor. The chopping stopped. Willa went to the open cabin door. A young man from the telegraph office in Redemption Ridge was galloping into the yard, his horse lathered and breathing hard. "Mr. McCrae!" the rider yelled, pulling his horse to a sharp halt. "Telegram, marked urgent, from Cheyenne!" Silas walked over from the woodpile, his face set. He took the yellow envelope from the boy's hand. "Water your horse at the trough before you head back," he said, handing him a coin. Willa stood in the doorway, the quilt clutched tight, a sudden, icy dread washing over her. Silas tore the envelope open. He read the small slip of paper. Willa watched his face, the peace of the morning, the tenderness of the night, vanished. The man she had held was gone, replaced by the hard, cold stranger from the church.
"What is it?"
she asked, her voice trembling. He looked up from the paper, his eyes finding hers. They were flat, dangerous. "It is from the sheriff in Cheyenne," he said, his voice level. "He is asking after you. By name. Says a man passed through, asking for Willa Hart." The world tilted. What man? What name? "A man," Silas said, his eyes never leaving hers. "Named Monroe Kane." The name hit her like a physical blow. Not Jasper, not Elias, Monroe Kane. A man Jasper had owed money to. A man who ran 3 saloons and a dozen girls. A man who believed Sadie had stolen from him. A man who had sent word once, years ago, that he would find Willa and collect his debt.
"Oh, God,"
she whispered, her legs giving way. She grabbed the doorframe to hold herself up. Silas watched her reaction, his face grim. "He is dangerous."
"He is?" she stammered. "He is poison. He thinks I have something, money Sadie stole. But there was no money. He will not believe me. He will... Silas, he will kill you. He will burn this place down. I have to go. I cannot bring this here. I have to run."
Her old instinct screamed at her.
"Flee. Disappear."
She backed into the cabin, her eyes wide with a terror she had not felt in years. Silas followed her in. He walked past her, to the wall where his rifle hung. He took it down. He went to his trunk, pulled out a box of cartridges, and began to calmly, steadily, load the weapon. "You are not going anywhere," he said.
"You do not understand him. He travels with men. He will not stop."
"He will." Silas walked to the cabin door. He looked at the heavy wooden bar, at the hinges. He walked to the window, checking the latch. It will hold. Willa stood in the middle of the room, shaking so hard the quilt fell from her shoulders, leaving her in her thin nightgown. She looked at the open door, at the hills, at the promise of escape. She looked at Silas, standing solid as the mountains, checking his rifle. She took a breath. She thought of running. She thought of being cold and alone and hunted for the rest of her life. Then she walked to her small, cold room. She did not pack her bag. She pulled on her calico dress. She braided her hair, her hands shaking, but her motions sure. She walked back into the main room. Her fear was a cold stone in her stomach, but the panic was gone. She picked up the coffee pot and moved to the fire.
"He will be here in 2 days, maybe 3,
she said, her voice quiet. Silas nodded. Satisfied with the door latch, I am staying," she said. He stopped his work. He looked at her. A faint, hard smile touched the corner of his mouth. "I know," he said. "Now, make the coffee. It is going to be a long 2 days." The 2 days of waiting were a poison. Every sound, the snap of a twig, the call of a hawk, the distant whinny of a horse, made Willa's heart seize. She cleaned the rifle 3 times, her hands slick with oil and fear. She and Silas spoke little. The intimacy of their night together had been buried under the immediate, cold weight of survival. They were partners in a siege, not lovers. On the 3rd morning, Silas stood, his face grim. "Stay here. Bar the door. Do not open it until you hear my signal. 3 knocks, then 2. Where are you going? To town. I will not be hunted. I will meet the threat. He will kill you. Silas, you cannot face 3 men alone. I am not going to fight him. Not yet. I am going to see what the law has to say. He put on his hat, checked his pistol, and slid the rifle into the scabbard on his saddle. He looked at her, his eyes hard. Remember, 3 knocks, then 2. He rode out. Willa barred the heavy door. The cabin became a box, and she the animal trapped inside. She paced, the loaded rifle heavy in her hands, her gaze fixed on the window. Silas rode into Redemption Ridge just before 10 o'clock. The town was quiet, but it was the quiet of a held breath. He tied his horse outside the sheriff's office, not the mercantile. The door was open. Sheriff Brody was at his desk, staring at a cup of cold coffee. He was a man in his 50s, with a heavy mustache and eyes that had seen too much trouble. "Silas," he said, his voice heavy. He did not look up. "Brody, you should not be here. You should have taken that woman and ridden for the mountains." "So it is true. He is here." "He is—" Brody finally looked up. His eyes were tired. "Monroe Kane. Arrived an hour ago. He is over at the saloon. Him and 2 hired guns. Men I recognize from the Kansas cattle drives. Hard men." "What does he want?" "He claims that woman of yours, Willa Hart, stole $500 from him 4 years ago, after the death of her sister. He says he has a writ for her. Says she is his property, same as a runaway apprentice. She is my wife. Brody, I filed the papers." The sheriff sighed, rubbing his face. "Silas, you know what a man like Kane is. He is not a drifter. He is business. He has connections in Cheyenne, in Denver. The men he hires, they do not care about a local marriage certificate." "Are you going to let him take her?" Brody stood, his frustration clear. "What do you want me to do? He claims a debt. I have no proof he is lying. You have no proof he is not breaking the law. Not yet. He's just asking. If I step in, he will call it interference, and his men will gun me down. For what? For a woman from the Golden Nugget?" "She is Mrs. Silas McCrae," Silas said, his voice flat and cold. "That does not change her past. I have known Monroe Kane since Abilene. I have seen him take a man's business, his house, his wife, all with a smile and a piece of paper. He is a patient snake. Silas, he will not move until he is sure he can win. He is giving me until sundown. He demands you hand her over." "No." "Then you are on your own. I cannot risk a war in the street for her. I will not." Silas stared at the man, his contempt a cold, hard thing. He saw not a man of law, but a coward. "I see." He turned and walked out. He unhitched his horse, his mind working. Brody was useless. The law in Redemption Ridge was afraid. He rode back to the High Lonesome. Fast. He did not see the man watching from the saloon window, the man who noted the direction he rode. Willa heard the hoofbeats. She scrambled to the window, the rifle raised. She saw it was Silas, riding hard. She ran to the door, fumbling with the heavy bar. He burst in, his face a dark thundercloud. "He is here!" Willa's hand went to her throat. "What happened? The sheriff?" "The sheriff is a coward. Kane is at the saloon with 2 men. He told Brody you stole $500. He claims you are his. He has given us until sundown." The old terror, the one she had held back for 3 days, crashed over her. She stumbled back, her eyes wide, looking for her carpet bag. It was the only thing she knew. Run, disappear. "I have to go," she whispered, her voice shaking. "I have to leave. I can go north, through the passes. He will not find me. He wants me, Silas, not you. If I am gone—" "No. You do not understand. He will burn this place. He will kill you. He will take everything, just like they took Sarah. I cannot let that happen. I cannot be the one who brings that to you." She grabbed her thin shawl, the one she had arrived in. She was moving toward the door. Silas caught her. He grabbed her arm, his grip like a steel trap. He spun her around to face him. "You are not Sadie," he said, his voice low and fierce, "and you are not running." But he stopped her words with his mouth. It was not the tender kiss of their wedding night. It was not the desperate, clinging intimacy of the storm. This was a kiss of pure, hard possession. It was a brand. He kissed her with an anger that was not directed at her, but at the world, at Cain, at her fear. He held her head in his hands, his mouth staking a claim. He broke the kiss, but he did not let her go. He pressed his forehead against hers, his breathing harsh. "We face things together now," he said, his voice rough. "You are my wife. You are not a ghost. You will not disappear on me." She looked into his eyes. The panic was still there, a cold sickness in her stomach, but his will was stronger. She sagged against him, the fight to flee leaving her. "All right," she whispered. "Together." "Good. Now get your coat. We are not staying here. He knows I rode this way. He will send his men here first." "Where are we going?" "The old line shack, in the north pasture. It is hidden by the woods. We can see the trail from there. Get food, blankets, and the ammunition." They moved fast, packing like soldiers. Silas loaded the pack horse with enough food for a week, his rifle, and 2 boxes of cartridges. Willa grabbed the blankets, the heavy skillet, coffee, and the first aid tin. They rode out, not on the main trail, but up through the rocky creek bed, leaving no easy tracks. The line shack was little more than a single, small room built of rough-hewn logs, nestled deep in a stand of pine. It was cold, damp, and smelled of mice and old smoke. It had a small stove, a single rickety cot, and a table. It was, Willa thought, even smaller than the room she had been given at the ranch. But from the rise just above it, they could see the trail leading to the High Lonesome, a long, winding scar on the land. They settled in. The isolation was immediate and profound. The waiting at the cabin had been tense. This was suffocating. They were trapped together in a 10 by 10-foot box, the world reduced to this patch of woods and the enemy that was coming. Silas took the first watch, sitting on the rise with his rifle, his body still. Willa tried to make the shack habitable. She swept the floor, built a small, low fire in the stove. The smoke was thin, disappearing into the thick pine branches. Night fell. The woods came alive with sounds. An owl, the rustle of a porcupine. Every noise was a man's boot on a twig. Silas came in, his face set. "My watch is done. Get some sleep." "Sleep?" she asked, a bitter laugh in her voice. "You have to. I will take the door." He sat on the single stool, his back to the door, the rifle across his knees. Willa lay on the cot, but she did not sleep. She watched him. She watched the way the weak firelight caught the silver in his hair, the hard line of his jaw. The next day, it began to rain. Not a storm, but a cold, miserable, weeping drizzle that turned the world gray. The fear and the isolation stoked something else, a desperate, sharp-edged desire. They were 2 people pushed to the very edge, and all they had was each other. The second night in the shack, the rain turned to a proper storm. The wind rose, lashing the small cabin, and thunder rolled down from the high peaks. Willa was standing by the small window, staring out into the black, churning woods. She was shaking, the sound of the thunder, the violence of the storm. It was stripping her bare. "He will find us," she whispered. "A man like that, he will not stop until he finds us." "Let him come," Silas said from the stool. His voice was a low growl. She turned to him. The terror of the past 4 years, the image of Monroe Kane's cold eyes, the memory of Sadie, it all came to a head. She could not run, she could not hide, and she could not bear the waiting. She walked to him. He looked up, surprised, as she knelt in front of him. "Willa?" She did not speak. She put her hands on his knees. She was shaking. She was done with fear. If this was the last night, if Cain was coming at dawn, she would not spend it cowering. She leaned in and kissed him. It was a hard, desperate kiss, tasting of fear and the metallic tang of the rain. She put her arms around his neck, pulling herself up, pressing her body against his. This was not the gentle claiming of their first night. This was a fiery, desperate act. It was a refusal to be erased. It was as if by pressing their bodies together, they could forge a shield. He responded, his arms wrapping around her waist, lifting her. He stood and carried her the single step to the cot, kicking the stool away. The storm outside raged. The rain hammered the roof, and the storm inside, the one she had held back, finally broke. As his hands moved over her, rough and certain, the memories came. They were not gentle. They were sharp, fragmented, and brutal, intercut with the present, with the feel of his skin, the sound of the rain. She kissed his neck, her teeth grazing his skin, trying to anchor herself to the moment. The memory, sharp as glass. Sadie, her face bright and defiant, packing her small valise. The red dress laid out on her bed. He is taking me to Cheyenne. Willa, we will have a house. He loves me. Silas's hand was in her hair, his mouth on her shoulder. He was holding her, not gently, but hard, as if he too were trying to hold on. The memory, Willa, pleading in the hallway, her hands clenched. He is a gambler. Sadie, he does not love you. He loves what you can do for him. He loves that you are young. Sadie's face, turning cold with a youth Willa had already lost. You are just jealous. Because Elias left you. You are ruined. And you want me to be ruined, too. Willa gasped, her nails digging into his back. The pain of the memory, the sting of the words. She pulled him closer, trying to blot it out with the force of the present. The cot creaked under their combined weight. The memory, the boarding house room, the smell of stale whiskey, unwashed sheets, and something else, something sweet and sick. The sheriff holding her back. Do not look, Miss Hart. It is better you do not look. But she had seen the small, pale hand hanging off the bed, the empty brown bottle of laudanum on the floor. She cried out, a sound that was half sob, half passion. It was a desperate, raw plea for life, a final defiance against the memory of that room. The memory, the note, the last thing. The sheriff had given it to her, her name, scrawled in Sadie's familiar hand. She had unfolded it, her hands numb. He took everything. It is all gone. He said I was as stained as you. I am so cold. It is all your fault. Your fault. She clung to Silas, her body shaking with the climax of her grief and their desperate act, as the thunder cracked directly overhead, as if the sky itself were breaking apart. After they lay still, the rain softened, returning to a steady, quiet weeping. Willa was curled against him, her body slick with sweat, her face pressed into his chest. He held her, his arms wrapped tightly around her, his heart hammering against her ear. She was shaking, the sobs coming quiet and deep, the final breakdown she had held off for 4 years.
He is going to kill us,
she whispered. Silas held her tighter. He kissed the top of her head. He whispered promises. Promises he knew he might not be able to keep. I will not let him take you. I will die first. He will not touch you. I swear it. She tilted her head back, looking up at his dark, shadowed face. Her eyes were raw, but clear.
If I die,
she said, her voice small but steady, I do not want it to be in a cold room, alone, like her. I want it to be here, in your arms. I am not afraid, Silas, not with you. He held her, the weight of her words settling on him, heavier than any storm. He left her before dawn. He rode hard, not to the ranch, but back to Redemption Ridge. He did not go to the sheriff. He went to a small house on the edge of town, where Judge Cyrus Abernathy lived in retirement. Silas had helped the judge 3 years prior, when his wagon had broken an axle in a blizzard, saving his life. The judge, an old man with eyes as clear and sharp as winter ice, opened the door.
Silas McCrae, you look like you have seen the devil.
I am about to face him. Judge, I need your help. They sat in the judge's study. Silas laid it out. Monroe Kane, the claim of debt. Sheriff Brody's cowardice.
Kane claims she is property, Silas finished. He says he has a writ. And what do you claim?
The judge asked. His fingers steepled.
She is my wife. I filed the papers with the circuit clerk in August. She is Mrs. Silas McCrae.
Judge Abernathy was silent for a full minute. The law, Silas, is a flimsy shield against men like Kane, but it is the only shield we have. His writ is from a corrupt judge in Cheyenne, I would wager, based on a gambler's debt. But your marriage certificate is from this territory. It is binding. Brody will not enforce it. Brody is a coward, the judge said, his voice full of contempt. But he is still the sheriff. He must obey a direct order from the judiciary. And I am still a judge, retired or not. He went to his desk, pulled out a piece of heavy paper, and dipped his pen. He began to write, his hand steady and sure. This, he said, sanding the ink, is a writ of protection. It states that Willa Hart McCrae, as your legal wife, is under your guardianship and the protection of the laws of Wyoming Territory. It voids any prior claim of debt or indenture. It makes her untouchable, as long as she is with you. He signed it with a flourish and stamped it with his seal.
Thank you, Judge. Do not thank me. Son, this piece of paper is only as strong as the man who holds it. Kane will not care about the ink. He will care about the rifle you carry. This paper just gives you the right to use it. It makes your justice legal.
Silas took the paper, folded it, and put it in his breast pocket. It felt heavier than a plate of gold. He rode back to the line shack. Willa was on the rise, the rifle in her hands, watching for him. The relief that washed over her face when she saw him was a painful, beautiful thing.
It is done,
she asked. It is begun, he said. He looked at the paper, then at her. Kane wants a confrontation in town. He wants to shame you and to show the sheriff he has the power. We will not hide in the woods. We will give it to him. We are going back? We are going back. Together. He mounted his horse. He held his hand down to her. She looked at it, then put her hand in his. He pulled her up, seating her in the saddle in front of him. She leaned back against his chest, his arms around her. He held the reins in one hand, the folded writ in his pocket. Together, they rode out of the woods, down the long trail, toward Redemption Ridge. They were not running. They were returning, prepared for the fire. They rode into Redemption Ridge at high noon. The town was waiting. It was not a welcoming committee. It was a jury. Windows were curtained, but faces peered from the gaps. Mr. Thatcher stood on his boardwalk, arms crossed, a silent, watchful judge. Willa sat in front of Silas, his arms around her. The paper from Judge Abernathy was a stiff, crackling square in his breast pocket. His rifle was in the scabbard, his pistol on his hip. She felt the steady rise and fall of his chest against her back. He was calm. He was a mountain. They were not heading for the sheriff's office. They were heading for the saloon. Silas intended to post the judge's writ on the door, a public declaration. They passed the livery, the horse's hooves a muffled, lonely sound in the thick dust. The shot came from the alley between the mercantile and the assay office. It was not a warning. It was a killing shot. Willa heard the sharp crack and an instant later felt the slam. Silas's whole body seized behind her. A grunt of pure, sharp pain was ripped from his chest. He did not cry out. He simply stiffened, his arms tightening around her in a last, convulsive spasm.
"Silas!"
she screamed. He fell from the horse, pulling her with him. He twisted, his body taking the brunt of the fall. shielding her one last time. He hit the street, a heavy, solid impact, and a cloud of pale dust rose around them. "Run," he choked, his face ashen, his eyes wide with shock.
"Willa, run!"
His rifle had fallen from its scabbard, landing just out of his reach. A dark, wet stain was spreading rapidly across his left shoulder. The same shoulder, the old wound, now new again. She was on her hands and knees, paralyzed, the dust thick in her throat. The world had gone silent, the gunshot still echoing in her ears. "Well, Miss Hart, you have been a difficult woman to find." Monroe Kane stepped out of the alley. He was not a barroom brawler. He was a man of cold business, dressed in a black suit, his vest a pale, expensive gray. He held a pearl-handled revolver, not at Willa, but at Silas, who was trying to push himself up with one arm. Behind Kane, his two hired guns fanned out. One was the tall man in the dirty duster Willa had seen in her nightmares. The other was younger, with nervous eyes and a shotgun. "You have caused me a great deal of trouble," Kane said, his voice conversational. He smiled, but his eyes were flat, like polished stones. "And you have cost me an employee." He nudged the tall man. "Pick her up. Tom, we will settle the bill with her husband later. He seems indisposed." The tall man, Tom, holstered his pistol and advanced. He grinned, showing brown teeth. "Come on, girl. The boss wants a word." He reached for her. Willa looked at Silas, bleeding in the dust. She looked at the man's hand, reaching for her, the same kind of hand that had grabbed her in saloons. In back rooms, the hand of Elias Thorne, the hand of Jasper Croft. And she looked at the rifle, Silas's Winchester. It was 3 feet away. The terror, the old, familiar paralysis, was there. It was a cold sheet of ice, but beneath it was the new fire, the fire from the line shack, the memory of Silas's kiss. "We face things together now." The man's hand clamped onto her arm. She did not scream. She did not plead. She reacted. With a strength she did not know she possessed. She twisted, yanking her arm from his grip. She lunged, not away, but toward the danger. She grabbed the rifle, the wood smooth and heavy in her hands. She stood. The world snapped into a sharp, clear focus. She was shaking. Her hands trembled so violently she could barely hold the weapon. But she did. She pulled back the lever, the shing-shing of the action, a brutal, metallic sound in the silent street. She chambered around. Monroe Kane stopped smiling. "Put it down, girl. You do not know how to use that." The man, Tom, recovered his surprise. He was angry. He lunged for her again, reaching for the barrel. "You little—" Willa pulled the trigger. The explosion was deafening. It was a physical blow. The recoil of the heavy rifle slammed the wooden stock into her shoulder. A brutal, numbing impact that sent a shock of pain down her arm. Everything stopped. The man in the duster stopped. He stood perfectly still, his eyes wide, a look of profound, stupid surprise on his face. He looked down at his chest, where a dark, spreading stain was blossoming over his heart. He made a small sound, a grunt, and fell, face first, into the street. He did not move again. A high-pitched ringing filled Willa's ears. Smoke, sharp and acrid, curled from the barrel of the rifle. She was still standing, her arms locked, the gun still pointed. She was shaking from head to foot, but she did not fall. Silence. A terrible, profound silence descended on the street. Then, doors opened. People emerged from the mercantile, the hotel, the livery, Mr. Thatcher, Mrs. Miller, her face pale, Preacher Miller, his mouth open. They had seen it. They had all seen it. Monroe Kane's face was a mask of cold fury. He raised his pearl-handled revolver, not at the sheriff, but at Willa. "You little bitch! You will pay for that!" "Hold it, Kane!" The voice was rough, and for the first time, it held authority. Sheriff Brody was at the end of the street, his own rifle raised and leveled at Kane's chest. He was pale, but he was no longer a coward. He was a man who had just witnessed a shooting in his town.
"She murdered my man! Sheriff!"
Kane yelled, his voice echoing off the buildings.
"You all saw it! That was cold-blooded murder!"
"I saw a man shot while defending his wife." The new voice cut through the tension like a razor. Judge Cyrus Abernathy, in his shirt sleeves, walked into the middle of the street. He carried no weapon, but he moved with an authority that stopped everything.
"This is not your affair, old man,"
Kane snarled, his pistol still wavering between Willa and the judge. "It is precisely my affair, Mr. Kane," the judge said, his voice booming in the quiet. He held up the paper Silas had carried. "Sheriff Brody, I have here a writ of protection for one Mrs. Silas McCrae. It confirms her legal status as a wife, under the guardianship of her husband. Your claim of debt is null and void in this territory. And your man," he pointed at the body in the dust, "was shot while committing an armed assault on a protected citizen, as were you." Kane's face went white. He looked at the judge. He looked at the sheriff. He looked at the remaining hired gun, who was slowly, nervously, raising his hands. And he looked at the townsfolk, their expressions no longer fearful, but cold and angry. He was no longer a snake in a chicken coop. He was a wolf, surrounded. "Sheriff," the judge commanded, his voice like the crack of a whip, "arrest this man and his associate for ambush, attempted murder, and attempted kidnapping." Brody, emboldened, stepped forward.
"Kane, drop the gun, now!"
Kane stared, his chest heaving. He looked at Silas, who was trying to push himself up on one arm, his face a sheet of sweat and dust. He looked at Willa, who was still holding the rifle. Her eyes locked on him. With a curse that was half sob, half snarl, he threw the pearl-handled revolver into the dust. The moment the threat was gone, the moment Sheriff Brody snapped the cuffs onto Kane's wrists, the strength that had held Willa upright vanished. The heavy rifle clattered to the ground. A sound tore from her throat. It was not a word. It was a high, keening wail, the sound of an animal in mortal pain. She fell to her knees and scrambled through the dust to Silas.
Silas!
She sobbed, her hands hovering over the bloody, ruined shoulder. She was afraid to touch him.
"Oh God, Silas, stay with me, please, stay with me."
He was fading. His skin was pale and clammy, but his eyes were open, and they were fixed on her. He tried to smile.
"You stayed,"
he whispered. The words were barely audible.
"Help him!"
Willa screamed, turning her face to the silent, watching crowd. Her voice was raw, breaking.
"Somebody, please, help him. He is bleeding."
The spell broke. Doc Hemlock pushed through the crowd, his black bag in his hand. "Get him to my office. Gently, now, gently." Mr. Thatcher and two other men moved forward. As they lifted Silas, Willa broke down completely. She clung to his good hand, her body shaking with a storm of sobs, her face streaked with dust and his blood. She walked beside them, a ghost in a waking nightmare, deaf to the whispers, blind to the stares of pity and awe. She had held back the fear, the shame, and the violence for years. Now, in the middle of Main Street, in front of the entire town, Willa Hart fell apart. He lived. The bullet, Doc Hemlock said, had passed clean through. It had struck the same shoulder as his old wound, shattering what was left of the muscle and tissue. He had lost a dangerous amount of blood, but the bullet had missed the artery. He would survive. Willa did not leave his side. For 3 days, Silas lay in the small, clean room behind the doctor's office, lost in a high fever. Willa sat in a hard-backed wooden chair, a permanent fixture. She bathed his face with cool water. She changed the bloody bandages, her hands gentle and steady. She forced broth and water between his cracked lips. She did not sleep. She just watched him, her mind a numb, gray void. The town, which had seen her raw, public grief, kept its distance, but they were no longer hostile. Sheriff Brody locked Monroe Kane and his man in the jail, to be sent to the circuit judge in Cheyenne. The body of the man she had shot was buried in an unmarked grave on Boot Hill. When the fever broke on the 4th day, Silas woke. He saw her, asleep in the chair, her head slumped forward, her face haggard and stained. He reached out with his good hand, his right hand, and touched her hair. She woke with a start, her eyes wide and panicked.
"Easy," he whispered, his voice a dry rasp. "Easy, wife. We are safe."
She stared at him, and the relief was so profound it was almost painful. She put her head down on the edge of his cot, her hand gripping his, and wept silently. They returned to the High Lonesome a week later. Silas was weak, his arm bound tightly to his chest, but he was walking. Willa drove the wagon, her back straight. The journey was slow. The cabin was just as they had left it, quiet and cold. She settled him by the fire, then went out to do the chores. She fell into a new, grinding routine. She did her work, and she fed the chickens, milked the cow, watered the horses. She checked the fence lines. She cooked. She tended his wound. Her body ached, but it was a good ache. It was the ache of work, not fear. But she was haunted. She was quiet. Her hands, which had grown so tough and capable, trembled when she held a coffee cup. She found herself scrubbing the cabin floor, over and over, as if she could scrub away the memory. She would stand at the window, staring at nothing, and see him, the man in the duster, the look of surprise, the fall. She had killed a man. She had taken a life. She knew Silas had killed. He had hunted down the men who murdered his family. It was part of what made him hard, what made him safe. She had always seen that justice in him as a part of the landscape, like the granite hills. Now, she had a piece of it inside her. She did not feel hard. She did not feel just. She felt sick. She felt stained, in a new and more terrible way than the saloon ever could. One night, a month after the shooting, Silas was sitting at the table. He was stronger. He could walk without tiring, and he was using his good hand to mend a piece of tack. He watched her. She was pacing, from the door to the hearth, a restless, caged energy she could not burn off. "What is it, Willa?" he asked. His voice was quiet, but it filled the small cabin. She stopped pacing, her back to him. "I killed him." "Aye," he said, his voice neutral. "You did." She turned, her eyes wide, haunted. "What does that make me? Silas. I took a life. I pointed a gun at a man, and I did it. And the worst part is, it was easy. I just pulled the trigger." "It was not easy," he said, his eyes on his work.
"It was,"
she insisted, her voice rising.
"I did not even think. I just did it. Am I a murderer now? Am I like Cain? Am I like you?"
He stopped his work. He looked at her, his dark eyes clear and steady. Slowly, using the table for support, he stood. His face was tight with the effort, his wounded shoulder still stiff and painful. He walked to her, stopping so close she could feel the heat from his body. He looked down at her, into her wide, frightened eyes. "You are nothing like Cain," he said, his voice rough. "He takes for sport, for profit. You defended. What you did was not murder. It was a choice. You chose to stand. You chose to fight. You chose us." He reached up with his good hand, his right hand, and cupped her cheek. His thumb stroked the line of her jaw. "You ask what it makes you?" he said, his voice dropping to a low growl. "It makes you free. Cain is gone. His kind will never hunt you again. The town will never shame you again. You are not a victim. Willa, you are not saloon trash. You are not a stain. You are my wife. and you are free." She leaned into his hand, a long, shuddering breath escaping her. She closed her eyes, a single tear slipping from under her lid. He was right. The ghosts of Sadie, of Elias, of Jasper Croft, of Monroe Kane, they were gone. She had banished them with a single, deafening shot. The next day, a wagon rattled up the trail. Willa's hand went to her hip, but there was no pistol there. It was just an old habit. She went to the porch. It was Mrs. Thatcher, her face set in its usual sour lines. She held out a basket. "Doc Hemlock says Mr. McCrae needs building up," she said, not quite meeting Willa's eyes. "This is a chicken stew and fresh bread." Willa was stunned into silence. "Thank you, Mrs. Thatcher." Mrs. Thatcher just nodded, a curt, sharp movement, then climbed back onto her wagon and left. It was the first crack in the wall. A few days later, on a trip to town, Mrs. Miller actually nodded at her. The children who had once thrown rocks and insults, they waved. Silas healed, but he would never be the same. The doctor said the shoulder would always be stiff, weak. He would carry the limp in his arm for the rest of his life. The barn, which had been leaning for years, had suffered in a late spring storm. A section of the roof had caved in. "It needs rebuilding," Silas said one morning, looking at the ruin. "You cannot work," Willa said. "Your arm." "I can work," he said. "I have one good arm. You have two. Between us, we have what we need." And so they began. It was slow, hard, aching work. He could not lift, but he could measure. He could mark. He showed her how to brace the beams, how to set the posts. He taught her the math of it. He did the work he could with one hand, his face often pale and tight with pain, but he never stopped. Willia did the heavy work. She climbed the ladders, her new strength a surprise to her. She hauled the lumber. She hammered the nails, the rhythm steady and sure. Her hands, which had trembled with fear, were now strong and calloused. They worked from sunup to sundown, side by side. They were not just rebuilding a barn. They were building a life, a new one. From the ground up, the structure that rose from the ruin was straight and strong and true. By late August, it was finished. It stood proud against the setting sun, the new pine smelling sharp and clean. That night, they sat on the porch. It was almost a year to the day since he had brought her here. The night was hot, the sky a vast spill of diamonds. The coyotes were singing in the high hills, but the sound was no longer lonely. It was just the music of their land. Willa was leaning her head against his good shoulder, his arm wrapped around her. It was a comfortable, easy silence, one they had earned.
"I was thinking,"
she whispered, her voice quiet in the vast darkness, "about that first night in the church." His arm tightened around her. "Were you? I was so afraid. I thought you were a fool or a monster. I thought you would regret choosing me before the sun had even set." She tilted her head back, looking at his hard profile, etched against the starlight. "Do you still regret choosing me, Silas?" He was quiet for a long time. The only sound was the breathing of the world. She felt the steady beat of his heart under her ear, a rhythm that had become her own. He leaned in, his face close to hers, his beard scratching her cheek. His voice was a low, rough whisper. "Only that I did not do it sooner." He kissed her. It was not a kiss of claiming, or desperation, or passion. It was a long, slow kiss that tasted of coffee and contentment. It was a kiss of arrival. It was the kiss of a man who was, finally, home. The High Lonesome Ranch was a different place a year later. The name no longer felt right. It was no longer lonesome. The barn, rebuilt with Willa's own hands, stood straight and strong, its new pine boards smelling of resin and hard work. The garden she had planted by the cabin door was a riot of green beans, tomatoes, and squash. There were a dozen new chickens scratching in the yard, and a small, fenced pasture held 3 milk cows. Spring had come with a softness that year, as if the land itself had been given a second chance. Willa had changed with it. She was no longer the pale, haunted woman from the church. The wind and the sun had browned her skin and put a clear, steady light in her eyes. She moved with purpose. She could ride for 10 hours, mend a fence line with quick, sure movements, and handle the heavy Winchester rifle with an easy, familiar respect. She had killed a man with it, and in doing so, had killed the ghosts that haunted her. Her hands, once raw and chapped, were now strong and calloused, but they were gentle when she touched her husband. Silas had healed, but the limp was permanent. His left shoulder was stiff, his arm weaker than his right. He could no longer rope a wild steer or lift the heaviest loads, but his spirit was unbroken. He managed the ranch with a quiet intelligence, his strength now residing in his will and in Willa's. Their intimacy was no longer the desperate, fiery thing born of storms and fear. It was a deep, quiet current that ran beneath their days. It was the way he watched her as she cooked, a small, proud smile touching his eyes. It was the way she would stop her work to rub his aching shoulder. They slept in the big bed, their bodies finding each other in the night with an easy, trusting familiarity. The silence between them was not empty. It was full of shared understanding. They rode into Redemption Ridge on a Saturday. The town had softened, too. The whispers that had once followed Willa like biting flies were gone.
Mrs. McCrae!
"Mr. Thatcher called out, nodding from his boardwalk.
Mr. Thatcher!
Even Mrs. Miller, the preacher's wife, offered a tight, respectful nod. The town had seen Willa's public breakdown, her ferocious defense of her husband, and her back-breaking work in nursing him. They had seen her stand and fight when the sheriff had hesitated. She was no longer the saloon girl. She was Silas McCrae's wife, a woman of substance. As they loaded supplies, Willa saw a girl huddled by the stage depot. She could not have been more than 16. She had a faded carpet bag and a bruise on her cheek, and she was watching the street with the wide, terrified eyes of a trapped rabbit. Willa stopped. She saw herself in that girl. She saw the desperation, the fear, the lack of hope. She looked at Silas. He had seen the girl, too. He just nodded. Once. That evening, they talked. "My old room," Willa said. "The storage room. It is small, but it is dry and safe." "We have the wood left from the barn," Silas replied. "I can build a proper bed for it." The next week, they put a small, hand-painted sign on the community board in Thatcher's store. It did not say much. McCrae Ranch, room and board offered, inquire for work. It was a discreet signal, a light in a dark window. 2 days later, a woman arrived on a rented mule. Her name was Clara. She was pale, thin, and running from a husband in Denver who, she whispered, had broken 3 of her fingers. She was terrified. Willa met her on the porch. She did not offer pity. She offered what Silas had offered her. "You will have your own room. You will work for your keep. We will not ask you to be anyone other than who you are. You will be safe here." Clara cried, the first tears of relief she had shed in years. She was the first. By the time summer was high and hot, another had come, a young woman named Mary, who had fled a brothel in Cheyenne. The small storage room was no longer cold. It was a sanctuary. Redemption Ridge watched. They saw Silas, Willa, Clara, and Mary laughing as they mended the chicken coop. Preacher Miller rode out one Sunday. He sat on his horse, watching the 4 of them working in the garden. Willa tensed, expecting a sermon on sin. The preacher just tipped his hat. "A fine thing you are doing, Mr. McCrae. A fine Christian thing." The redemption of the Ridge was not just for Willa. It was for all of them. In late July, the mail rider brought a letter. He handed it to Silas, who then passed it to Willa. It was addressed to Mrs. Willa McCrae, formerly Hart. The postmark was from a small town in Kansas she had never heard of. The handwriting was neat, feminine, and unfamiliar. Willa's hands began to shake. It was the old tremor, a ghost she had thought long buried. Silas put his good hand on her shoulder, a steady, warm weight. She leaned into his touch and broke the seal. She read it silently first, her eyes scanning the lines, her face draining of color. "Willa?" Silas asked, his voice low. "It is from a girl," she whispered. Her voice choked. She sat down heavily on the porch step. She read it aloud, her voice gaining a strange, trembling strength.
Dear Mrs. McCrae, I am writing to you because I was told you were my mother's sister. My mother was Sadie Hart.
Silas went still. "My name is Elodie. I am 15 years old. I was raised by a family named Potter, here in Kansas. They are good people. They have just told me the truth. They were told my mother, Sadie, came here from Cheyenne, already, with child. She died just after I was born. Jasper Croft was not with her. Mr. and Mrs. Potter took me in." Willa's hand was gripping the paper so tightly her knuckles were white. "I do not know my mother. I only have a small silver locket they found with her things. I am not writing for money. I am writing because I need to know her story. I need to know who she was. I am told you are the only family I have left. I have saved my money, and I am at the stage depot in Laramie. I will wait there for 3 days, in hopes you will come." The letter fell from her fingers.
Sadie, a baby.
Not a suicide in a cold room, not an overdose of laudanum. She had died in childbirth, alone, but she had left something behind. The final ghost.
I have to go,
Willa said, her voice numb. Silas was already moving, walking toward the barn. "I will saddle your mare." She looked up at him, her eyes wide.
Alone?
He stopped, his hand on the barn door. He looked at her, his gaze clear and steady. "This is for you. Willa, this is your past. You have to face it yourself. I will be here when you get back." She rode out an hour later. She rode with a canteen, a bedroll, and the pistol on her hip. She was not the woman who had arrived in Redemption Ridge a year ago. She was strong, capable, and she was not afraid. The 2-day ride to Laramie was a journey into the last corner of her old life. She found her in the Laramie depot. The girl was small for 15, with a shock of pale red hair. Sadie's hair. She was clutching a worn carpet bag. And she looked up with Sadie's wide, hopeful, and terrified eyes.
Are you Willa?
The girl whispered.
I am.
They sat on a bench, the bustling noise of the depot fading away. It was bittersweet. It was like looking at a ghost. Elodie held out the locket. It was the one Elias Thorne had given Willa. The one Willa had given to Sadie before she left.
This was hers,
Elodie said. Willa's fingers closed over the familiar silver, and she talked. She told Elodie everything. She did not lie. She did not soften the edges. She told her about their small house, about Sadie's dreams, her bright, restless spirit. She told her about the saloon, about Elias, and about Jasper Croft. She told her about his charm and his poison.
She ran away with him,
Willa said, her voice thick.
She thought he was her escape, but he was a coward. He left her in Kansas, alone.
They told me she died of a fever after I was born, Elodie said, tears welling in her eyes.
She did,
Willa said, taking the girl's hand. The laudanum story, the sheriff's letter. It had all been a lie told by Jasper or by the town. This was the truth. She was alone, and she was sick, and she died, but she brought you into the world first. I never knew her. Elodie wept.
You know her,
Willa said, her own tears falling.
She was beautiful, and she was reckless, and she was loved. I loved her, Elodie, and I could not save her. But you came,
the girl whispered, clinging to her hand. You came for me. The last of the guilt, the last of the bitterness that had poisoned Willa for years, finally washed away. She was not holding a reminder of her failure. She was holding Sadie's legacy.
What will you do now?
Willa asked, after the tears had dried. My family, the Potters, they are good, but they are not my blood. I do not have a place.
Yes, you do,
Willa said, her voice sure.
I am your blood.
Come home with me. Come to the ranch. The ride back was quiet. Willa was terrified. She was bringing a child, Sadie's child, into the home she had built with Silas, a home where his own child had been murdered. How could he look at Elodie without seeing what he had lost? She was bringing the past into their hard-won present. They rode into the yard in the late afternoon. Clara and Mary waved from the garden. Silas was on the porch, mending a bridle, his head down. He looked up as they stopped. He saw Willa, and he saw the small, red-haired girl beside her, sitting shyly on her horse. He stood, his limp pronounced as he stepped off the porch. His face was unreadable, carved from shadow. Willa dismounted, her heart hammering against her ribs.
Silas,
she said, her voice trembling just a little.
This is Elodie. She is Sadie's daughter, my niece.
Silas looked at the girl. He saw her fear. He saw her youth. He saw the last ghost. Willa held her breath, waiting for the anger, the rejection, the coldness. Silas just moved. He walked past Willa. He walked right up to Elodie's horse. He looked up at the terrified girl. He did not scowl. He did not hesitate. He just reached up with his good hand. He did not offer it to her. He just opened the yard gate, pulling it wide. Welcome home, he said. Weeks later, the summer was beginning to fade, the air holding the first crisp promise of fall. Elodie's laughter, as bright and clear as Sadie's had once been, echoed from the barn, where Clara was teaching her to milk the cow. The ranch was full of life. A storm was rolling in from the west. The sky was a magnificent, bruised purple, and the air crackled, smelling of ozone and rain. Willa and Silas stood on the porch, watching it come. It was not a threatening storm, not like the blizzard that had trapped them, or the one that had raged at the line shack. It was just a storm. It was part of their life. It would water the pastures. Willa leaned her head against his good shoulder. She wrapped her strong, calloused hand in his, lacing their fingers together.
This life,
she whispered, her voice full of a quiet wonder. I never thought I'd be strong enough for it. He turned his head, his beard brushing against her hair. His voice was a low, rough rumble. You always were, he replied. You just needed someone to see it. She smiled, her eyes filling with tears. They were not tears of sadness, or shame, or fear. They were tears of peace. She turned her face up to his. She kissed him, a long, slow kiss that was as deep and steady as the roots of the pines. As they held each other, the first roll of thunder sounded, a low, contented rumble, as if the whole wide world were finally in agreement. Thank you so much for listening to our story. We would love to know where you are listening from, so please drop a comment and let us know. If you enjoyed this tale, please consider subscribing to From Wild West. We value your thoughts, so please share them with us in English.